Even though I have heard of this series before for quite a few years, I haven't actually played a single one of the Yakuza games until now. Is that even how you pronounce that word? Yakuza? Yakuza? Let me check real quick.
Yakuza.
Yakuza.
Alright, well that cleared it up. As I said, I never played any of the games in the Yakuza series. And reading up on it to figure out where to even begin, fans were pretty outspoken that the prequel, Yakuza 0, set in the late 80s, which was released after the first 5 numbered entries came out, would be a pretty optimal spot. It also helps that the first 2 games were PlayStation 2 titles, so playing something a bit more modern probably eased my way into it. That's not to say that this series is something you can ease your way into. This is about as Japanese as a game can get. As the title of the game implies, the narrative is about the Yakuza, Japanese organized crime syndicates. Though ironically, the 2 protagonists you play as aren't actually members of the Yakuza for most of the runtime of the game. The first of those characters is Kazuma Kiryu, the main protagonist of most of the games in this series. He's a young Yakuza who at the start of the game gets framed for murder, and his initial motivation is to clear his name. The second character is Goro Majima. He too is a former Yakuza who got kicked out of his clan for defying his boss's orders, but still kept on a leash by said boss, and his goal is to get back into his former clan. The story of these 2 characters circles a central narrative about a real estate development project that many high-ranking members of the Tojo clan have taken an interest in. The Tojo clan is the biggest crime syndicate in Japan, which consists of dozens of families, all of whom have many additional subsidiaries, so there are a lot of people represented who want to get ahead in the hierarchy. The story specifically concerns an empty patch of land in the fictional district of Kamurocho that represents the key focal point for the entire real estate revitalization project, with many factions vying for the opportunity to buy the land of the current owner if and when they should be found, in the hopes of not only raking in ungodly amounts of cash, but also climb up the ladder a few rungs in the process. Now I won't be discussing many details of the narrative here, because this game has a propensity for twists, double crosses, backstabs, and sudden narrative turns, so to go into any great detail would invariably lead to spoiler territory. But I have to say that I really liked the overall plot, at least once everything was cleared up by the end. Much of the runtime is spent figuring stuff out, and whenever the game does provide information, it often causes more questions to pop up than it's willing to answer. So for the longest time, it's entirely unclear where the story is even going. New characters turn up out of nowhere all the time, and everybody is covered in multiple layers of intrigue and manipulation. And since both of your protagonists are still very young and were at the bottom of the ladder before they got kicked out of their respective families, they have no clue who most of these people are. And I'm not sure how much of this is intentional, since this is a prequel after all, and I haven't played any of the other games. I certainly got the impression that some parts were specifically there to allude to later events that happened in the other titles, but it's not like you won't understand what's going on. And thankfully, most of the characters you encounter are so well realized that it doesn't take long for them to stick in your mind. And I really have to say, I haven't played a lot of games that nail characterization this well. As good as the writing for the narrative itself is, what stands out is the hands-down brilliant dialogue that really gives the impression that each and every character in this game, no matter how small their part may be, even in an entirely inconsequential side quest, feels like a fully realized human with a life and backstory of their own that inform their actions and motivations. Now obviously at this point I have to mention that I don't speak a lick of Japanese, and since this game only has Japanese audio, I can only gauge the narrative by the translated subtitles. And it does seem like a lot of effort has gone into Americanizing the dialogue. I have no clue if the original Japanese is this slangy, but they at least went to all that effort to make this otherwise frighteningly Japanese game a bit more Westerner friendly. And while I can't critique the Japanese voice acting to any great degree, from the sound of it and from personal experience of consuming Japanese media, it seems to be of equally high quality as the writing. But 2 aspects that the story can suffer from are regarding pacing and tone. And the reason why I say it can suffer from those issues is because that's entirely dependent on how you play the game. Since this is an open world game, there's often no urgency to engage with the critical path, and with the many ways Yakuza 0 offers to spend time doing anything but the main missions, it unfortunately weakens the overall impact of the main narrative. And said main narrative is a gritty action tale that stands in very stark contrast to the often extremely juvenile and silly side content strewn about the place. To illustrate this, here are a few side quests you can find in this game. You have to buy a porn magazine for a minor. You can find quote-unquote telephone cards of real-world adult entertainment actresses to unlock very softcore erotic videos of them. You have to train a dominatrix to be better at her job. You can help not Michael Jackson and not Steven Spielberg shoot the not Thriller video in the streets of Kamurocho. You can help retrieve a video game stolen from a young boy by a thug, who loses it to a bigger thug, who then loses it to a Yakuza, who turns out to be the dad of the boy it was initially stolen from with the intent of gifting it to the boy. You can pretend to be the boyfriend of a girl who wants to convince her father to stop trying to hook her up with other men. You can infiltrate a religious cult to free a young woman from their indoctrination. And these are just a few of the many side quests you can stumble upon. And I haven't even done all of them, so who knows what kind of wacky and crazy shit you can find. And even that's not enough. You have a crafting system, and attached to that a system that allows you to send agents into the world to gather raw materials and blueprints. I have absolutely no idea why it's even there or what it's useful for, because I haven't crafted anything in my entire time with the game. Heck, the game even has equipment slots for weapons and other items that boost defenses, but they seemingly only exist in those equipment slots. If you equip a weapon, it's not suddenly in the hands of the character, it just applies its stats to your character. It's the most basic version of implementing RPG stats I've seen in a long while. You can even do specific training to equip certain weapons, but this just seems like a massive waste of time, like a lot of stuff that you can do in this game. Not to mention the two massive time sinks that are the Cabaret Club and real estate businesses. As part of the narrative, both main characters get to run a business of their own, and the aim here is to oust a group of 5 rivals in each city. Majima takes over what the game calls a Cabaret Club in Sotenbori, basically a hostess club that opens up a minigame where you have to entertain male customers by pairing them with fitting hostesses. It's a decent enough minigame overall, and it also involves a lot of talking to some of your hostesses, so again the writing gets to shine. Kiryu, on the other hand, gets a real estate business and has to buy up all the properties in Kamurocho in order to get rid of his bunch of rivals. Unfortunately, this minigame wasn't as entertaining as the Cabaret Club. In fact, there is no attached minigame to it at all, so all you can do is buy up properties, shuffle around management and security personnel, and sometimes you'll have to intervene yourself when trouble arises and answer to challenges of each of the 5 competitors. And these challenges usually incorporate one of the minigames available in the rest of the game. While the Cabaret Club follows a pretty steady progression, the real estate business suffers greatly from the way it's designed to waste the player's time. Because the prices of those properties get so astronomical and investments into them get so tedious and slow that it honestly just becomes fatally boring after a while, so at some point I simply abandoned it. I get that the intent with the real estate business was to incentivize doing a bunch of side quests to get additional personnel that has higher stats to speed up the process, but honestly a system designed to be mitigated by making the tedious bits go away is a badly designed system. I'm not sure I can recommend doing either of these side quests, because they can both eat up over half a dozen hours on their own, but if I had to choose, the Cabaret Club would certainly be my pick. It has actual gameplay attached to it with well-written interpersonal character drama, and the villains are all fun to deal with. But be prepared to sink a lot of time and effort into these side stories that in the end don't really have that big of an impact. They do unlock an additional fighting style for your characters, and you'll obviously amass a huge fortune, but that's about it. But don't fret if you don't want to waste your time on those 2 activities, because Yakuza 0 has an absurd number of ways you can spend your time otherwise. There are minigames for pool, darts, bowling, fishing, dancing, batting, karaoke, gambling, and a variety of board games. And probably the silliest of those is an underground catfighting arena where you can bet money on scantily clad women, battling it out with rock, paper, scissors RNG mechanics. It's astounding how much effort went into providing the player with tons of ways to spend time in this world. But I guess it's also fairly congruent with how detailed much of the rest of the game is. Convenience stores have a ludicrous amount of individually modeled items on their shelves. There are tons of vehicles, signs, and trash in the streets, and it really manages to evoke the feeling that this is a living, breathing city. And yet, the complete absence of driving means that all of it stays within walking distance, so there's never a need to travel around for extended periods of time. Until now, I've really only talked about the narrative and the minigames, but between all of that, what is there actually to do in Yakuza 0 beyond walking from place to place and watching absurdly long cutscenes? The meat and potatoes of the gameplay is a fairly arcadey beat-em-up fighting system. Each character has 3 fighting styles available to them, fast, strong, and an in-betweeny one, each with a dedicated upgrade tree. And for what it's worth, I wasn't really sure why they decided to make them 3 distinct styles, because I managed to get through the game with only the strong style. The only time I needed to switch to the fast style was when I had to cover larger distances to get to the enemies wielding guns, because those are priority targets that need to be taken out as quickly as possible. And for some reason, the game simply doesn't allow you to sprint with the heavy style. So I guess I like the variety it theoretically offers with the 3 styles, but it's not like it's all that useful to switch between them. Especially since the game only allows you to switch styles when you're standing still, so no switching on the fly mid-combo or even while you're lying on your back if an enemy manages to land a hit. The reason I stuck with the strong style was because in Kiryu's case it allows you to use environmental objects to hit enemies with, so if you're lucky and see a motorcycle on the side of the road, go pick that sucker up and beat up a bunch of thugs with it. Similarly, Majima's strong style comes with a bat, so you have a permanent weapon that allows for quite a few combos to be pulled off. To be honest, this fighting style is so overpowered it mostly breaks the challenge curve of his sections. Still, as entertaining as the fighting is, it seems like it's not something that can be mastered with any finesse. And many of the frequent random encounters get really boring after a while, because if you can find a couple of overpowered moves to dominate enemies, even the boss fights end up being fairly trivial button mashy affairs. I think this draws one of Yakuza 0's biggest downsides into closer focus. It's this insistence of providing the player with so many things to do, so many avenues of wasting time that keeps the final product from being as excellent as it could be. I mean, according to the in-game timer, it took me 55 hours to get through the game. During that time, I tried to do as many side quests as I could find, and they're not always easy to find, especially the ones that can only be accessed during certain chapters, so once you move on, you can't do them anymore. And I even sunk a considerable amount of time into the Cabaret Club and real estate businesses, and yet I'm only at 40% completion. This kind of scattershot approach of trying to do as much as possible but nothing really excellent also extends to the presentation. I've mentioned earlier how detailed the environments are, and many characters and objects are textured extremely well. But then you have odd things that look absolutely atrocious, like the spherical ice cubes in the drinking glasses that look like shit, or the hood of this car that looks like it consists of square segments. The animation quality is also all over the place. The pre-render cutscenes look amazing, but the in-engine stuff look like its original PS1 era stuff. I was seriously reminded of Final Fantasy VIII a few times whenever I saw multiple characters execute the exact same animation simultaneously. Characters also unconvincingly flap their mouths during a lot of these conversations. Not to mention that some of the characters look extremely lifelike, probably thanks to excellent digitization of the actual voice actors' faces, but the player characters both look like hulking brutes with bricks for a face, because they need to conform to how they looked in those original PS2 games. And unfortunately, the lifelike faces often fall into uncanny valley territory when the animation doesn't manage to make these faces behave realistically. Now I have to wonder what prompted the developers to implement 4 different kinds of cutscenes in this game. There are obviously the aforementioned pre-rendered cutscenes, but then you have the voiced in-engine stuff, which could have been pre-rendered just as well most of the time. I get the in-engine cutscenes that are only subtitled, because voice acting all this stuff isn't cheap, and if you don't speak Japanese, you're already used to only looking at the bottom third of your screen whenever someone is talking either way. But then there are also a few key cutscenes that are voiced but barely animated. I don't know if this was a stylistic decision or not, but it's just weird to see all these different styles employed without rhyme or reason. In the end, I feel Yakuza 0 is a bit of a mixed bag, but while the game overall is spread too thin for all the stuff it wants to present the player with, I still feel it's an excellent game to play. In many ways, it's less than the sum of its parts, but I still can't get around a recommendation here. For one, as I said, I love the way the story is told, and the writing and characterization are stellar. And the breadth of activities that the game offers means that there's something in there for almost anyone. I love that it's both a serious gritty crime drama and yet also has plenty of space for silly shit like Mr. Libido. And no, I'm not going to explain what his deal is. You'll just have to play the game yourself to experience this delightful fellow. Honestly, Yakuza 0 reminds me of the good old days when games didn't take themselves too seriously. It still aspires to tell a compelling story, and it absolutely achieves that goal with gusto, but it's also profoundly aware that it's still a video game, which are mostly intended to be fun. And Yakuza 0 is fun. It's a game filled with extremely serious-looking sacks of meat in fancy disco suits beating the shit out of each other with bicycles, so what's not to love? You can find a lot of entertaining stuff to do in here, but the biggest advice I can give you is that if you encounter something besides the critical path that you don't understand or care about, you're more than justified to skip it, because I think this is how the game is intended to be played.
For breaking the law.